Hello and welcome to episode 6 of 11FS Spotlight. In this weekly show, we shine the spotlight on the best and the brightest in tech and financial services to try and understand what gets them going, growing, and what they think of the future of the industry will look like. Joining me today is Lord Vaizey, who's a current member of the House of Lords and the former Culture and Digital Minister. Ed, thanks so much for joining us today. How are you doing?
Very well.
Good stuff. And where are you joining us from?
I'm joining us from Shepherd's Bush in leafy West London.
Lovely, lovely, lovely.
From my palatial lordly mansion.
Cool. Again, thanks so much for joining. A big part of this show, as the listeners will know, is your involvement and your questions. So please leave them in the comments sidebar and we will get to them today on the show for you live. So let's start off by talking about yourself, Ed, a little bit about your history and what you do.
So I was an MP for 14 years, got elected in 2005 for the great constituency of Wantage and Didcot, which is west of London. Some of your listeners, viewers might have heard of Didcot. Didcot Parkway is a very famous railway station on the way to Swindon and Bristol, and that's how most people know it. But it's actually a constituency full of tech and science. It's an interesting blend because it's got it's quite rural, even though it's quite close to London. And it just after the war, they set up a nuclear research facility because it was rural enough that if things went tits up, not many people would be killed, but it was close enough to London that they could still kind of access the skills that they needed. But Harwell has left it also had the largest munitions dump in Britain. Half the ammunition that went to the first front on the First World War came from Didcot. But those two legacies meant that Milton, which is where the ammunition dump was, has become a massive business park, Europe's largest business park, with a massive focus on life sciences, the kind of things like research into T-cell receptors, which might cure cancer, for example. And Harwell has a huge amount of science, including the diamond synchrotron, which is basically a massive microscope. It's also got an outpost of the European Space Agency, lots of space industries and tech industries are based there. So there's a lot of science and tech in Didcot and Harwell, but that has nothing to do with my then subsequent political career, which I was appointed the technology minister by David Cameron, and I was responsible for things that all your listeners and viewers might curse me for, which is the quality of their mobile phone coverage, the quality of the broadband into their home. But I also worked across the piece on the tech sector, both with big tech, Facebook and Google, and also with the startup sector in terms of how do we encourage, tech to scale and grow in this country? How do we encourage people to invest inwardly? How do we get the skills that we need? So I got to know the tech community very well. And then I was fired by Theresa May, having served for 6 years as the technology minister. And then I was fired by Boris Johnson, having rebelled on Brexit. I lost the whip and became an independent MP. And then Boris and I kissed and made up. And I decided I'd had enough of the House of Commons anyway. And I left at the end of last year. And then Boris put me in the House of Lords. So that was a very nice sort of new chapter to my life. And I'm on the Communications and Digital Committee in the House of Lords.
Yeah.
And that is basically one of the committees that would look at kind of tech issues. In fact, one of the inquiries we're thinking about doing is into kind of content regulation on the internet, which is not strictly related to fintech, although there might be some tangential connection. But, looking at the kind of fintech sector might be something, for example, the Communications and Digital Committee looked at in the future. So it's a great way of me continuing to maintain my interest in the sector.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I guess, you were the longest serving cultural and digital minister. So I suppose if you're looking at highlights during your period in Parliament, what would that be? And I guess, specific potentially to fintech or the tech sector, but what if you could sort of, pick out 2 or 3 highlights that have certainly shaped the way that I guess the tech sector looks like in the UK at the moment, what do you think they would be?
So I've frozen on your screen, which shows that one of the highlights was not delivering reliable broadband to everybody's home, even in Shepherd's Bush, where I meant to get 68 megs, but that's not delivering. And I also have a 5G iPhone, which did deliver me 250 megs in the street the other day. So I was quite pleased by that. So I've no idea whether this is being recorded or indeed if anyone can hear us talking. We may just be talking.
You are coming through loud and clear.
Maybe talking in a tottering Shepherd's Bush bubble. But I think, I think it was a range of things. It's very hard to pick out one individual point. I think that the fundamental point was that the Cameron government was a very tech-friendly government. And it wasn't just me. There was a guy called Rohan Silva, who was the technology advisor in Number 10, then succeeded by, who's now gone off and started this company, Second Home, which is a kind of, we work for tech workers. Daniel Korski, who succeeded him, who started Public, which focuses on the GovTech sector. You had Francis Maud, who did a hell of a lot, despite being a very old man, did a hell of a lot to transform government digital services. So you got, at one point, I think we were kind of world leading in terms of how we delivered government digital services. But I think the fundamental point was we were seen as tech friendly. And that included things like the tax system, so Seed EIS and the EIS scheme, very, very friendly to people who wanted to invest in tech startups. A real focus on the kind of skills and attracting people to, base their companies in the UK because of the access to the skills that they had. Funny enough, despite the sort of controversy surrounding big tech, working with companies like Google and Facebook, who effectively made the UK their major base outside of the US.
Yes.
Again, that kind of created an ecosystem that both attracted talent, and then that talent spun out and created their own tech startups. But I think the other point, which brings us to a certain extent to fintech, is that we were very focused on creating organizations that were supportive and created this dialogue with the tech community. So the tech community was always going in and out of Downing Street. I regularly would do events where people would turn up in shorts and t-shirts to evening receptions in the middle of winter to kind of make the point that they were tech entrepreneurs.
We still do that.
I never had the courage myself to do it. I still turned up in the boring Tory MP suit and tie, but I may have occasionally taken my tie off. And but things like Tech Nation, which was Tech City, I always say that Tech City, in fact, it wasn't me who said it. I think it was John Chambers from Cisco. We had a meeting with him and David Cameron when he was announcing £500 million investment from Cisco. But he said that Tech City kind of just said, the UK is open for business. We want the tech community. So things like that had a big impact. There were committees. There's currently a government committee on artificial intelligence, for example, and all of these things were saying, tech is coming, change is coming, we want to be ahead of the curve as far as government can be and embrace it. And that included things like Innovate Finance, yes, which George Osborne actively created because he wanted a trade body that supported the fintech community. It included things like sandbox regulation for fintech, so people could have a discussion, particularly when you're trying to break into a regulated industry, have a discussion with the regulators. We want to do it this way. Is that a problem? It included, controversial decisions with some people to back the Ubers of this world to say, this is not about trying to stop innovation. Innovation is here. The mindset was much more, how do we adapt regulation so that innovative and disruptive companies can go about their business? So it was a whole range of things. I've probably been a bit incoherent, but I would say it was just the mindset of supporting tech, the tax treatment of tech, the engagement with tech, both big tech and startup, and specific government bodies that were focused on different sectors where it was felt a really kind of more granular dialogue with government was needed.
Yeah, it is amazing because that period of like 2010 to 16 would have seen the initial seed raises for companies like Monzo and Starling,
Yeah.
Oak North, TransferWise, who have gone on to incredible things. And the legacy of that is, to your point, we had Tech Nation actually on this show a few weeks ago now, talking about their latest cohort. I think Fintech 3, where they've brought in 20 or 30 new companies, despite what's going on at the moment, to sort of support and grow some amazing initiatives. And we know Innovate Finance very, very well. It's all sort of bred a reputation for the UK, enforced actually by things like open banking as well, which has just come up here as sort of still the knowledge leader, if you like, in financial services and fintech around the world. And I know from 11FS that we get asked by different geographies quite a lot to opine on certain aspects that we probably wouldn't do if we weren't based in London and based, I guess, in the heart of the fintech community here. I guess from your point of view, what are we over the next, let's say, 2 years, given Brexit as well? Do you think we can maintain that kind of distinction as the place to go for fintech services and fintech knowledge, or and actually not so much fintech, but tech in general, I guess?
So I do my own podcast called the Vaizey View, which is probably ranked 750,000th in the Apple business podcast rankings. But I did a little tour. I went to a virtual tour, obviously, to places like Estonia, Holland, and France, and Israel as well, where I know different random people. And one of my friends is Pascal Cagny, who's sort of the French tech ambassador. And back in the day, I did a couple of events with Macron when he was the kind of economy minister, which allowed me to obviously tweet that I was so delighted that my great friend Emmanuel Macron had become president of France, which about a dozen other Tory ministers also tweeted. But it was clear that it was an interesting point that I met him in London when he came. It was actually Balderton, the venture capitalist who hosted him, where he came to meet the French tech community, and the French tech community were in London. That's where they wanted to base and grow their businesses. So what's changed between the UK and Europe? Well, I think there are probably three things. First of all, Brexit. I think that is a big problem. We haven't yet seen how it's going to affect us. But the point was the French tech community was in London because they knew that, if they wanted a French CFO, that person could come and move to London like that. And if they wanted a German CTO, that person could move to London like that. That's going to be much more difficult, I suspect, in the future. And I find this kind of anti-immigration stance bizarre. I mean, Trump has done it with the H-1B visa in the US. I mean, it's crazy to stop highly skilled people being mobile. So that's change number one. Change number two, and I deliberately mentioned Macron, is because, Macron has had this massive focus on tech. And he has been really, promoting France's as a place to set up your tech company and so on, and supporting the tech industry. And you've got these, Station F and so on and so forth, really making a big impact, I think. So that's point number two. I think point number three, which is where we have a chance of a kind of score draw, is that politicians, loved, it was always the mantra, where is Britain's Silicon Valley? Well, Britain has a Silicon Valley. Broadly speaking, it's kind of Oxford, Cambridge, and London. It's a pretty amazing and similar geography, because people forget that Silicon Valley, you can travel 2 hours to a meeting and so on. You can get from London to Oxford in an hour. You can get from London to Cambridge in an hour. So we have Silicon Valley. We have the skills, and we have the universities. We have all of that. What we don't have is the kind of capital. And that's a kind of organic thing. It comes both from just a risk appetite, which I think the US has, which we don't. It comes from founders who have cashed out, who bring not just their investment, but their experience to create the next generation of unicorns, if you like. And I think that we do definitely have this inbuilt advantage with fintech, because London is a global financial center. And that, I don't think that will go away overnight. I think Brexit will hinder it a bit, but I think we're eminently adaptable. We're effectively, again, another US outpost. All the Wall Street firms are here. So I think if you're in fintech, you've got a much better chance of a score draw, to counter my two other points, which are mildly pessimistic, because you have access not just to, you have access to capital, and you have access to the financial experience people to work in your business. So I think the fintech sector in the UK could continue to be a kind of poster child for UK tech.
And it is interesting that I think in H1 this year, there's been about 1.8 billion investment into UK fintech, which is down from H1 in 2019. But then actually the amount of money being put into the respective companies has actually grown. So there's kind of a view that although, generally, I suppose VC investment into fintech companies has gone down because of the pandemic. On the flip side, the actual valuation of these companies, probably maybe because of the legacy of the UK fintech scene, they're actually more valuable now than they were last year, and certainly more valuable than they were the year before that, which shows great progression.
Yeah, no, I think it's another point actually we shouldn't forget. I think one of the things that people never really talk about why the UK is successful in tech is the UK consumer.
Yes.
I heard a kind of apocryphal story, which I'm sure is untrue, but I love it anyway, which is that apparently because EasyJet was the first website where you could book an airline ticket online with your credit card, the kind of British consumer got used to buy e-commerce much sooner than other consumers. And when I was always being berated for rubbish broadband in Britain, I did make the point, look, if the broadband is so rubbish, why do we lead the world in internet usage in terms of people buying stuff online? And I think, if you compare UK financial services, particularly consumer financial services, to the US, I mean, the US is in the Stone Age. I mean, trying to open a bank account, and so on and so forth, and all the kind of rudimentary financial transactions are much more complicated in the US than they are here. So I think that's why there's been that is another factor that we don't perhaps talk enough about, which is, I'm a Monzo customer, and I was in the House of Lords the other day when this, dare I say that I'm not a crusty lord, I probably am, but a slightly crustier lord than myself got out his Monzo card, and I think, he's definitely not the typical Monzo demographic. The fact that we kind of have things like compare the market, the fact that we probably do change our mortgages more often, and the fact that it's easier to kind of secure a mortgage online, all these things make, I think, a big difference. So again, I think there's a lot in the ecosystem which is not in the gift of politicians, which should be encouraging to the fintech community in the UK.
It's good to see that Monzo's made it to Parliament. That's and the House of Lords, no less.
Yeah.
Just a quick one from me, because you mentioned that kind of Silicon Valley type, I suppose, belt that we've got in the UK with Oxford, Cambridge, and London. And I don't want to necessarily start talking about broadband coverage around the UK, because it sounds like you've probably got a few war stories on that. But it sounds like you might not want to tell them. But I suppose from your perspective, do you think it's always going to maintain that, just because of the universities and just because of London, that the kind of the tech centre in the UK is going to be, if you like, down south rather than shifting more up north, or being more balanced, I guess?
It's a difficult one. I mean, I think, I was saying earlier today at another webinar I was doing, London is I think it's the world's only truly global city in terms of the kind of diaspora you have here. I mean, famously, when we held the Olympic Games, I was told that London was the first ever Olympic city where every country represented the Olympics had at least 20,000 people living in that community, in the city. And so as a global city, it's always going to attract international talent and investment. And that is hard to compete against. Either the glass is half full or half empty. If you're living in Liverpool, you should perhaps be grateful that London is on your doorstep. You can base yourself in Liverpool, but you can access all sorts of kind of global services potentially in London. Having said that, one of the things that I think is fantastic about tech is that it is quite mobile, and you will find tech in all sorts of different places. Edinburgh is a great financial centre, for example. Manchester is a fantastic city for tech.
Yes.
Leeds apparently is great for health tech. because of GCHQ kind of knocking around Cheltenham, you're going to find a lot of cyber companies. Leamington Spa is a centre for video games development. I mean, who knew? But it is.
I saw
just as
Kevin
Dundee is because of Rockstar Games.
I was going to say I saw a Kevin Bridges skit the other day on Leamington Spa, but yeah.
So, but you know, London is London. It's a unique global city, and what depresses me is London gets knocked so much by the rest of the country. London's a massive asset, but of course, any politician is right to have the debate about spreading wealth and spreading opportunity. And to a certain extent, a lot of cities have to potentially sell themselves better. I do a lot of work with Newcastle University in the northeast, and you know, you've got in Leeds, you've got Sky Bet, I think, is in Leeds now. You know, leave aside going down a rabbit hole debating gambling. Sky Bet is a fantastic tech company, which, you know, has recruited 400, 500, 600 highly qualified programmers. If you're a student at Leeds University, you probably don't know that Sky Bet's down the road. And you head straight back to London looking for your tech job.
Yeah, as I did, because I went to Leeds University.
Well, there you go. Adam, you are the problem.
I might not have known it at the time, though. It was a fair few years ago now. Just I haven't gone grey yet, but I'm going. No, that's also, and I guess from your perspective, is that kind of the awareness of that? Is that something that the government should play a part in, or is that more these companies actually sort of speaking up for the communities that they're embedded in? Because I'm kind of interested to know whether you think it should be the onus on of the government and government bodies or committees like the one you've just joined, or actually is this something for the companies themselves to promote?
Tech Nation does a great job of identifying the strengths of different cities. That's probably where I picked up that healthcare tech is based in. There's a centre in Leeds, so you can do that, and I think universities can do that. So I think there needs to be, what I picked up from working in Newcastle is there needs to be much greater collaboration between businesses and universities, both in terms of obviously commercializing research and seeing, you know, they're obviously a major resource for research, universities are, but also engaging with students much earlier. And also, I think, you know, the nature of education obviously has to change massively, particularly in tech, because you can't possibly, I think, have traditional university courses that can keep up with the pace of change of tech. So there needs to just be a much more symbiosis. I mean, I think one of the great mistakes, getting really nerdy here in terms of public policy, was the abolition by the Conservative government of regional development agencies. I mean, you can't really, you do need these kind of local geographical bodies that have an overview of the local economy, by which I mean the Northeast or the Northwest, who can really make big strategic decisions.
And I guess one thing I did want to talk to you about was 5G, because a lot of people probably have, and just I guess given your background, a lot of people probably think that 5G is coming, but don't know any of the benefits, I guess, that could bring. And it is worth saying that, you know, a lot of the functionality that a lot of the banking apps and Neo challenges was based on was because 4G connectivity in the UK was so good that you could sort of move from, you know, one app to another pretty seamlessly on the go without Wi-Fi, and you know, you'd have a seamless customer experience, and you'd have you know, a pretty high fulfillment rate of the customer journey you were embarking on. In your mind, what does 5G give that 4G doesn't, and then how might that help the tech sector?
Well, it does, in theory, give you better speed, and I mean, as I was saying earlier, I think while we were live, you know, the speed in my house is meant to be around 60 megs. The speed on my 5G phone is around 250 megs when I've speed tested it in some parts of West London. So in theory, it will give you much better functionality as a consumer using a smartphone. And also, obviously, the great 5G promise is, you know, download the movie in 1 minute. But the other thing that 5G should help transform will be the kind of sort of back office, if you like, in the sense that the ability for sensors and so on to gather data. So the kind of smart city initiative depends on 5G to have loads of connected devices, and the ultimate vision might be that you would have effectively kind of mini data centers at the end of your street that will be processing all this information. So you could get the ultimate smart city. What the fintech applications for that might be would be very interesting. It may just be just in terms of payments processing and so on and so forth. They could have consumer applications to do with smart city and financial transactions. But the headline is obviously, in terms of what you'd read in the newspaper, is the consumer getting faster speeds on their phone. The real story is the transformation of the Internet of Things and the ability of machines to talk to each other and to have many more machines that can talk to each other. So it may well be that down the line, fintech companies start to market specific 5G devices that allow you to engage in financial transactions at home and so on that you can't at the moment.
Couldn't have otherwise. Yeah, the IoT, Internet of Things. I think one of the biggest blockers they've always said is that connectivity piece and I suppose the transference of to having sort of voice-based interactions to mobile, and then how that works. And they say that would work a lot better from a speed perspective and journey perspective on 5G. So that'll be interesting to see. I wanted to focus slightly on the pandemic because no possible interview at the moment avoids it. But from your perspective, how damaging could it be? I suppose I'm not going to just say to the tech sector, but to the UK and this kind of whirlwind that we're in now with that we've got Brexit plus the pandemic. And do you think are we going to sort of bear the brunt of it any more than anybody else, just because of the numbers that we've had and the fact that we're sort of in and out of lockdown along with France and a few other European countries? Or do you think actually, hopefully by this time next year we'll be out of it, in which case, life will just return back to normal?
So look, we are bearing the brunt of it, and a lot of people blame the government. But I think to put it into context, we are a service economy. I mean, one of the great strengths of the UK, although we love to knock ourselves a lot, is that we do tend to be actually ahead of the curve from most other countries. Again, if you go to Europe, it's a wonderful place, but some of the kind of things that we take completely for granted here as consumers in terms of ease of doing business are much, much more complicated when you go abroad. So we've transformed our economy over the years into a service economy, and a high-end manufacturing economy. But a service economy gets clobbered by something where you can't serve anyone. It's highlighted the importance of traditional industries like hospitality, but the creative industries, which I looked after, film, video games, television, those kind of industries, and the arts and graphic design and so on, have all been hit. So it doesn't surprise me that we've had a bigger impact on our economy than perhaps other countries. I hesitate to say lockdown skeptic, because that makes me sound like a sort of Trumpian headbanger. But my fundamental problem with the government's approach to COVID has been that we haven't put in place rules that we can all live with. Because I would love a vaccine to come tomorrow morning, but I think you have to start from the premise that a vaccine won't come, and that we have to live with the virus. So you need rules that people can follow consistently over a period of time that don't keep clobbering the economy. And I have to say, and I'm not close to it, and I know the guy who runs NHSX, I'm staggered at how incompetent test, track and trace has been. I mean, I'm just absolutely gobsmacked. If you were going to take one kind of military approach to the pandemic, it would be to ensure that there were testing stations. No one lived more than half a mile from a testing station. You focused on getting tests that were rapid with their results, and you focused on the tech in terms of being able to isolate people, as they do in the Far East.
Yes,
where you are quarantined and your phone, it sounds horrible and authoritarian from our perspective, but your phone is monitored. And that would probably allow, as has happened in the Far East, a relatively normal functioning economy where people who are sadly infected are isolated very quickly and treated rapidly.
I mean, it is amazing when we hear figures like 12 billion being bandied around, which is the cost of the track and trace system here. I mean, it's hard to know without looking it up and going into the detail what that actually is brought thus far. But from somebody who, you know, is used to building up, let's say, applications and banking apps from scratch, a 12 billion figure is quite generous, to say the very least. So yeah, I mean, one would expect a little bit more than probably what one's got at the moment. But yeah, I mean, it is an incredible figure. That I'm sure expectations were certainly a little bit different, definitely from me when I downloaded it. I just wanted to ask you. I wanted to focus on one more thing, and then I think we've got a couple of questions that have come through. One more area is around, and you mentioned it before fleetingly. It was around education in schools. We don't normally bring it up necessarily, but you. Because people aren't necessarily in a great position to be able to talk about it with authority. But in your position, and obviously with your history, when it comes to tech education, I know there's a lot of sort of new curriculum and new focus on coding at the moment in schools. But just in general, do you think the way that tech is taught should improve, should get better, and actually should be something that's taught all throughout, you know, a child's school life now, from when they start all the way up to essentially GCSE, A level? I don't think they're called A levels anymore. I'm going to show my age, but A levels and then beyond.
So one of the first things I did when I became minister in 2010 was to commission a report from a guy called Ian Livingston, who was the founder of Games Workshop and then ran IDOS, the games company.
Oh yeah.
And he's a kind of man in his 60s, but he's a sort of games guru. And a guy called Alex Hope, who ran a visual effects company called Double Negative. And Ian had been banging on to me when I was in opposition about how coding was the new Latin and people needed to learn how to code, even though, of course, Ian himself cannot code.
Right.
And we commissioned this report, and one of the recommendations that Ian made was that coding should be in the national curriculum and completely and compulsory and revamped. And I said, you'll never get that past Michael Gove, who's in the Education Secretary. The only technology Michael Gove believes in is a blackboard and a piece of chalk. But amazingly, he got it past him, and Gove revamped the coding GCSE and made it compulsory. But that's all very well. I haven't seen much really happening in schools. I was talking to Brent Hoberman from Founders Forum yesterday, who made the point. There's this initiative. I think it's Xavier Niel in France has this level 42. I think it's called Coding School, which is free. And you get in just based on aptitude, not on your qualifications. It's completely free, and it's really caught on. And the UK is the only country in Europe that doesn't have one. You know, you can go to Amsterdam, you can go to Germany. There's been one. So, but in secondary schools, I suspect that coding is not much better. Yeah. And it does strike me as odd. You know, I've been talking on a lot of podcasts today, and I keep saying I want to smash things up, which sounds like a very angry, lockdown, middle-aged man. But I kind of want to write a book, you know, what have the Victorians ever done for us? And I think what frustrates me about education is if you walked into a school having been teleported from 1850, you'd think, well, broadly speaking, I can tell what's going on here.
Yes.
And if there's any kind of skill that could be taught online and gamified and engaging for young people, it's probably coding. And yet there seems to be no initiative to do that, to give people these basic building blocks and access. And if you talk to people, particularly in the games industry, who have kind of made it, and people in their kind of 50s, they all say, it's a bit of a cliche, that it was the BBC Acorn computer in the 1980s, which I am old enough to remember, that got them into it, because they were just sat at home and played around with it. And we have the Raspberry Pi now, but we need something. We need some kind of government encouragement to get kids at home coding. And it's all very well for me to say I'm not a coder, but you know, you can't. It's hard to recruit the kind of teachers who are going to have that skill set. I think we have to approach these things in a different way. And again, I think to a certain extent, if it's led by business people that these kids, you know, would look up to and say, you know, I want to be like that person who's teaching me some of these basics. I think you could do a lot of it online.
Yeah.
But there's a whole issue there about, you know, access to technology for kids, particularly kids from low income backgrounds and so on. That's another whole chapter of policy to discuss.
Yeah, I mean, that is interesting around the you know, if you're a developer at the moment, I'm thinking about my development team and how many of them would sort of pack up their career in development and go and become teachers. It's probably a low amount at the moment, but it is
Yeah.
interesting in terms of how do you build that kind of consensus around developers that's a potential profession for them going forward. That is really interesting. One question that we've got a couple in, but we're sort of running out of time. Ivan, I'm going to try and pronounce the surname, Radonovich, apologies if that's not right. How do you see Singapore as a kind of a tech hub, I guess? Is it competition, or is it kind of new ideas? And actually, I think sort of expanding from Singapore specifically, I guess Asia as it is, do you see, and did you see when you were in office, did you see sort of the wave of new tech coming through from Asia? Something which was in competition with the UK or actually in partnership with the UK?
So I went to South Korea a lot, and I was also the trade envoy to Vietnam. I mean, I think to a certain extent, there are kind of obviously significant cultural differences and actually geographical differences which still apply in the world of tech. And I'm always interested that, it's taken a while for some of the huge Chinese companies to really enter our consciousness, and still me as a sort of tech commentator, if you like, will talk about Facebook and Google, but I won't talk about Tencent or Ant or Alibaba. And I've never used WeChat. I use, WhatsApp or Signal or whatever. So there are definitely, and TikTok is famously the first kind of Chinese consumer tech brand to break through. So there are, straightforward cultural differences, and I say that in a neutral way, that there just are, and there are geographical gaps. So it doesn't feel to me, weirdly, I guess in the 70s and 80s, there was much more transference when you think about the domination of Japanese consumer technology of the Western markets. It feels to me like there is actually less of that. Obviously you have companies like Huawei and Samsung are very dominant in the hardware market. But it just doesn't feel at the moment that kind of consumer focused and fintech is, we're losing out to competitors in Asia. Just as I don't think the Asian companies need to particularly worry about UK or US fintech going over there. But I think, we have a trade commissioner based in Singapore now, and we have a much more kind of impactful engagement in trade in that part of the world now. So I'm not close enough to be blunt. There's no doubt there must be some opportunities to cross-fertilize and gain ideas at both ends.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Ed, thanks so much for that. That was really insightful, and really enjoyed that. Thank you so much for taking the time and coming on and talking about all things tech. That was great.
Thanks, Adam.
Where can people get to know or get in touch with you? Get to know you, but get in touch with you. So what's, I suppose, your medium, your social medium of choice, I guess, if people want to reach out to you?
My Twitter is @EdVaizey, ED, and then my surname, which is difficult to spell, VAIZEY. I'm on LinkedIn as Ed Vaizey, and people can message me on LinkedIn, or they can message me on Twitter.
Amazing. Thanks so much. And to everybody else, that's all we've got time for. Don't miss our other live show, Newsroom, which goes live on Tuesdays at 3:30 BST, 10:30 AM ET, where we take a deeper dive into the biggest news stories of the week, every single week. And that's it for us for today. So thanks very much, and have a great rest of the week, everyone.